good morning to you. Thank you for joining us on Business Morning. I am Bisi Adebayo. The Monetary Policy Committee of the Central Bank of Nigeria will hold its third rate-setting meeting for the year today. Now, that meeting was earlier meant to hold on Monday and Tuesday, but had to be rescheduled because of the public holidays. And at the last MPC meeting in March, the committee left all key rates unchanged, citing the continued rise in domestic prices, the decline in oil prices, and exchange rate pressure, all caused by the ravaging COVID-19 pandemic. Join us at 1:30 p.m. as we begin our countdown to the MPC decisions and the live briefing by the CBN Governor Godwin Emefiele at 2 p.m. Meanwhile, in a bid to further ease the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic on households and businesses, the central bank has reduced interest rates on its facilities through participating financial institutions from 9% to 5% per annum for 1 year, of course, with effects from March this year. The CBN's Director of Financial Policy and Regulation, Mr. Kevin Amogo, who made this known in a circular, clarified that OFIs, such as microfinance banks and primary mortgage institutions, are granted leave to consider temporary restructuring of tenor and loan terms for households and businesses affected by the pandemic. Mr. Amogo explains that the regulator would continue to monitor developments and implement appropriate measures to safeguard financial stability and support stakeholders impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. The president of the African Development Bank, Mr. Akiwumi Adesina, has reacted to recent reports calling for reinvestigation by the U.S. Treasury Department after his exoneration of over-partiality in the leadership at the institution. In a statement released yesterday, Mr. Adesina reaffirmed his innocence with regard to the allegations, which seeks to challenge his integrity as well as the reputation of the bank. According to him, I'm confident that ultimately and as one collective body, the bank will emerge stronger than before and continue to support Africa's development drive. Mr. Adesina also says he'll continue to work with each and every one of the bank's shareholders to ensure that the AFDB maintains its hard-earned global reputation and that its credible and functional institutions and governance systems are reinforced. Now, a report from an agribusiness management firm, Sahel Capital Partners and Advisory, says Nigerian farmers on average generate the lowest yields for tomatoes in Africa at 4 metric tons per hectare. That's significantly lower than Egypt with 38.7 metric tons per hectare. Sahel Capital, in a report published in 2017, said yields are low as a result of poor production practices, including the use of old varieties, low soil fertility, inadequate pest and weed control, and the high post-harvest losses due to the poor handling and distribution system. In a bid to remedy the situation, the Standards Organization of Nigeria is developing a set of standard codes of practices for the tomato value chain from planting, harvesting, processing, and transportation to storage. A technical committee for fruits and vegetables products has been spearheading this initiative with a view to facilitate safe production of tomato for consumption through prioritized use of biopesticides as well as other human and environmentally safe operational measures. We're joined now by the Director of Standards Development at the SON, Mrs. Chinyere Egwonwu, for some insight into these codes of practice. Good morning, Mrs. Egwonwu. Thanks for coming on the program.
Thank you very much, and thanks for having me.
Now, first, Nigeria is a major producer of tomatoes in Africa. Why did it take so long to actually come up with this standard codes of practice for the value chain?
Well, standards are demand-driven because they have to be requests for it, and there has to be, need for it. We were able to work together. All these years, we've been working with the relevant stakeholders in the tomato value chain to be able to get that. So when we realized that there are a lot of issues involved, like you said in the opening, that there are issues of low yield, which results in low quality, issues on handlings along the value chain. So we had to develop the standards. It's not that the standards were not in existence. Some of them were in existence. But what we recently did was to review some of them, to update them, because with every day there are changes in technology, scientific changes and other changes, even government policies also changed. So we had to update some of those standards while we develop new ones to meet the challenges that the farmers are experiencing right
And
now.
how will this actually address some of these challenges that the farmers are facing?
All right. Along the technical committee that you mentioned developed about 5 standards from the planting to the storage, that's including transportation and storage. And then after that, there are value addition standards. So far, we've been able to develop standards starting from the planting. Planting, that particular standard will addresses the issue of low yield, which we have all known to be because of poor practices, the farmers not being able to use the right seedlings, and the farmers not being able to prepare their land very well to be able to accommodate that. So this particular standard addresses that. So it gives guidance and recommendations for the farmers to be able to handle their planting, right from preparation of the ground, to make sure they make the best choices concerning their seedlings, make the best choices concerning the quality, because that's in return subsequently affects the quality of the product. That is one. Then the other ones, like the next one is the harvesting. Harvesting, while you're harvesting, it is expected that while you're harvesting, you should be able to handle the products very, very well, the produce very well, in order to protect it from damages and deterioration and contamination as well. So this particular standard on harvesting also recommends good practices that the farmers must adhere to be able to harvest properly, be able to handle properly, even in harvesting, using the right harvesting implements, using the right collecting materials to collect this produce, and also making sure that in the course of harvesting, you do not mix up the healthy fruits with the contaminated, the ones that are diseased, because there could be cross-contamination. So that particular one takes care of that. The third one is the one on storage and transportation, which also addresses the issue that we have. You know, in Nigeria, there's been issues of, between January and April, there are high yield. You have a lot of tomatoes all over the place, but they're not properly handled because, number one, there are no storage facilities, or they don't even have knowledge of what to do. Even the transportation, instead of using those baskets, they should actually use crates that will protect, even at any impact, the crates will be able to protect those products. But when they use the baskets, at the impact, it crushes and destroys the produce. So this particular standards on storage and transportation also handles that issue of making sure that this the transportation from the farm to wherever it's going to its final destination or for further processing should be done in such a way that the product will be protected, will be carried along with the right transportation facility in the right condition. So that takes care of that. The committee also developed another standard that has to do with processing. You know, the processing of this to further value addition. When you have value addition, like those who would want to go further to produce fruit juice, tomato juice, tomato mix, tomato paste, there's another standard, that's the code of practice, that has handled that, taking care of, recommending good hygienic practices that should be in place when the farmers or who are the processors are handling such activity or process. So the standards are available. The aim for us is to ensure that these farmers, or everyone along the value chain, the tomato value chain, every player along the value chain has a standard that regulates, that guides its activities to ensure that they do the right thing and get out quality tomato fruits. We also have the standard for tomato, fresh fruits. That standard has been in existence for a while, but it was actually updated recently, what we call the review. By our act, we are expected to review our standards after 5 years. So you have to take another look at the standard to see whether it's actually very relevant with the current situation. So that was what was done and was updated. In the updating actually included, in order to make the standard more simple for understanding by the farmers, having the knowledge that most of the farmers are small-scale farm holders. And so we included pictorials that will guide them on the quality, what should they expect when their the tomato fruits are maturing, and how to start harvesting, and the other quality requirements, like there is also classification and grading. That's what we updated the old standards too.
So in reviewing these standards and developing new ones, do you actually work with these farmers? Because earlier on you talked about the issue of transportation and storage and all. So do you actually work with them when you're reviewing these standards?
Yeah, we work with every stakeholder that is involved in the value chain, the farmers, even actually the Farmers Association, even the smallholders, they were all part of it. Those who are, even the large farmers, we work with them, the stakeholders. We also work with even those that are involved in the transportation to tell them exactly what. So standards are actually developed by stakeholders, not SON. SON coordinates the activities of the standards development. And so we make sure that every stakeholder is engaged, because at the end of the day, they are the ones that are going to implement the standard. So we involved the farmers, we involved the research institutes, we involved the universities, we involved even the consumer organizations and the large, those who go further to add value to it.
Let's talk about the tomato value chain now. Of what significance is it, into the well-being of the citizens?
Well, for now, with the standards, with adherence to this standard, the main objective of this development of this standard is to ensure that the farmers and everyone who is a player in the value chain does the right thing. Once that is done, you have high-yielding tomatoes, you have quality tomatoes, you have availability of these tomatoes even when it is not the season, the high season, because it would have been properly stored, transported and all that. And so the farmers will benefit from their hard work along the years if they implement what is specified in these codes. And also that would also impact positively on us, Nigeria, our economy. Remember, the present government is working so hard to ensure the diversification of our economy from the oil to non-oil, and agriculture is one of the focus of the government. And so with so doing, it will also increase the availability of our products, improve the quality of our products, improve the availability for even for international trade, really, and so thereby empowering the farmers. That's the most important thing. Ensuring that the consumers have the right products, ensuring that even those who are involved in it also have benefit from the activity.
You just talked about consumers having the right products, and one of the things the consumer will be interested in is the right pricing. So is this in any way going to affect tomato pricing?
Well, I am not in the pricing agency, but what I would say is it would really not, because if farmers do what they're supposed to do, and we have them available, even when it is not even the high season, because they've been properly handled and stored, it will always be available. The pricing would not really be affected. You should also note that the standard I told you about talked about classification and grading. So depends. The price is dependent on what you want, what we can afford to get.
And what will be the implications of these codes for imported tomato products and those that are locally produced?
Well, for us, for the aim, and that's what we intend to achieve, is that if the standards since the standards are available and the stakeholders are adhering to it, number one, we wouldn't have need, because when there is low season, people want to go to all the imported ones. But with better storage and better handling, it's available at all seasons, at all times. And so we will not go for it. Secondly, value addition, the standards that we have developed for those value addition, like if you want to add value to the tomato fruits, would also enable increase in the production, local further processing of the tomato, thereby making those things that we would want to get from outside within us. And so it will reduce the taste for it, and then we would look inwards, and our own farmers and processors will benefit from that as well.
So what you're saying in essence is that the importation of tomato concentrates will soon be a thing of the past?
Oh yeah, that is our aim, and that is what we aim to achieve, and I'm sure you that we will definitely get there.
And now, who are the stakeholders who are actually involved in the development of the standards? I know we've talked about the farmers, we've talked about the SON, but are there other stakeholders that are actually involved in, updating these kind of standards?
Yes, there are so many stakeholders, like I told you. Apart from the farmers, we have the research institutes who carry out research. We have even those who do testings, laboratory, the IPAN, because the standard specifies the one for fruits, that tomato fruit specifies the testing that should be carried out. So that standard also gives room for, so we need even those testing organizations to be able to confirm that those test methods that we outlined there are okay and can be used for it. We have consumer association, like I have told you. We have also those who are in the market, those who sell tomatoes. We went as far as going down to the grassroots to bring them on board, because we needed to know their challenges to be able to put things in place, put requirements, put recommendations in place that will mitigate those challenges. So everyone that has to do, the transporters have to do, those who have cold stores or storage facilities for these tomatoes before they can be further processed, we're also involved in it.
Now, your committee, which is the Technical Committee for Fruits and Vegetables Products, says that the final resolutions have been submitted to the management of the SON for considerations. When are the calls likely to be approved by the Council and actually made public?
Okay, we look forward to Council approving by next month, because it was actually supposed to have been done, but because of the situation we have found ourselves with the COVID-19 pandemic. So we are planning that Council would meet by next month, and then it will be approved, and then will be circulated and for use, will be available for use.
Now, we understand that the project has some multilateral partners like the United Nations Environmental Programme. What's their role in this?
Okay, Nigeria, that particular organization was and is still working with the tomato farmers in order to ensure that whatever they do impacts positively on the environment. So they came on board as well to be part of that, because they had been working along that. And so we also took into consideration in the development of all these standards that the impact, the environmental impact of those activities on the activities along the value chain of the tomato, and ensure that that also was taken into consideration. So they played a very vital role in not just bringing in as many people as possible. Everyone that they'd been working with within the country were part of it, and they also supported us we had a support from them to be able to carry out this activity of developing standards.
So are there any sectors that the SON is likely to shift attention to for other standards subsequently?
Well, for now, maybe apart from the value chain right now, we are talking about the pandemic. And so there are lots of essential things that are needed for us to be able to manage this. So now our focus mainly is on making sure that those standards that are needed for the management of the COVID-19 pandemic are available. We have both international standards. We have those that we have developed, like the one for nose masks, the one for hand sanitizers, and the ones for ventilators. And there are even other organizations that are, with this COVID-19 pandemic, people are developing ventilators. We have a lot of people. So we're working together with them to make sure that they do the right thing and ensure that the standards are available. So the focus right now is on the pandemic, ensuring that the standards are available for the management of the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic.
In 1 minute now, are these calls likely to come with some sanctions?
Oh, sure, yes, if you don't meet the requirements. Well, not really sanction per se. The thing is, we ensure that you meet up with the requirements of the standards. And as you know, we have offices all over the country that will now, once the standards are ready, and we announce that they are available and they are ready, and we disseminate them to our various state offices, people can go there and get them. And then our offices also go to inspect them to ensure that they comply. If they don't comply, of course, we ensure that they comply. But if they don't, there are sanctions.
And would you like to tell us what some of those sanctions would be?
Well, in most cases, we don't really have such sanctions, because our job is with kind of facilitate manufacturers, facilitate trade. So what we do is, when you don't meet the requirements, we give you opportunity to do that. So most times, we don't even have it getting to that end where you will get to the extent of having a sanction. But the most important thing is that when we find out you consistently have refused or have not been able to meet up with the requirements of the standard, the first sanction is to close down whatever activity you're doing first, and then do investigation and allow you to put certain things in place before you can achieve that. But then the standards are available, and they are certifiable standard. That means that if you conform to them, you'll be given a certificate of conformance, which we call the MANCAP. the mandatory conformity assessment program. So, and it comes with a logo, a mark, and all that you can put on your product to show that you have met the requirements of the standard. So it comes with benefits as well.
That indeed will encourage them to adhere to those standards.
Yes.
Well, that would be a good point to leave the conversation. Director of Standards Development at the SON, Mrs. Chinyere Egwonwu, thanks for coming on the program.
Thank you so much for having me.
We'll continue our conversation about the tomato value chain when we return in just a moment. Please stay with us. Welcome back. We're still talking about the tomato value chain standards and the codes of practice to be introduced by the Standards Organization of Nigeria. Now, the country has the largest area harvested for fresh tomatoes in Africa with 541,800 hectares, followed by Egypt with 214,016 hectares as at 2014. However, research has shown that 40 to 50% of tomatoes produced in the largest African economy is lost. And that's due to poor handling, processing, and the preservation practices. But will the codes of practices being put in place by the Standards Organization of Nigeria be sufficient to address these lapses? Let's join the Chief Executive of Tomato Jos, Mira Mehta, who joins us from New York via Skype for this conversation. Good morning, Mira. Thanks for joining us on Business Morning. Well, let's start by taking you down memory lane. In 2015, when Nigeria experienced the tuta absoluta, commonly known as tomato Ebola, give us a sense of some of the actions that have been taken by farmers like you since then to prevent such occurrences.
Well, first of all, good morning. It's a pleasure to be on the show. You know, in 2015, as you rightly said, there was a major pest problem that swept across not just Nigeria, but all of West Africa. And, you know, one thing that Tomato Jos did that we implemented both on our own commercial farm and with our farmers was to really try and use the appropriate type of chemical pesticide that would attack that specific insect. You know, we've seen a lot of challenges with farmers not knowing what's available and farmers not knowing what to use for specific diseases. And this was an issue very much of that case. So, you know, a lot of it really is about education and then about making those products that will work available.
Now, having been growing and selling tomatoes in Nigeria technically since 2014, now, what are some of the challenges that you have had to face?
So post-harvest loss has been certainly a challenge. I know that's one of the challenges that SON is trying to address with their new standard. To give you an example, even this season during the coronavirus shutdown, that took place during the peak of our harvest season and during the peak of our farmers' harvest. And we had a really hard time getting fruits from Kaduna, where our farms are located and where our farmers are located, down to the major markets in Lagos and Port Harcourt. You know, a lot of the challenges, and I think that, you know, these challenges will remain regardless of what standard is in place, is that tomatoes are highly perishable. They may be in great shape when they leave the farm gate and they may be certifiable at that stage, but by the time they get down to the market, you know, it could be anywhere from 20 to 30 hours on the road. Those tomatoes will deteriorate, and you know that's a reality that we have to face in terms of, you know, just what it takes to do transport in Nigeria or in any country.
In a bit to ease some of these challenges now, the Standards Organization of Nigeria is developing some codes of practices and standards to actualize a valuable tomato value chain market. Are you actually aware of the standards?
Yes, I am. I have to commend SON. They did a lot to involve a broad base of participants in the standards creation. They did include technical and private sector members in their technical committee. So Tomato Jos was, in fact, involved in reviewing those standards once they had been drafted.
What does this mean for foreign investors, especially those investors and farmers like you that came with the aim of putting an end to the importation of tomato paste in the country?
It's a great question. You know, SON was initially put in place to help regulate and make sure that imported products were coming in at a minimum level of safety for consumers in Nigeria. And I think that if we look at SON in that light, in terms of trying to protect the consumer, in terms of trying to educate the consumer, I think that, you know, including a standard on tomatoes is certainly appropriate and will certainly help consumers. As a processor, tomatoes are one component part of the end product that we're trying to make, right? Which is the value add tomato product for the domestic market. And in that regard, for me as a processor, my concern is more around what is the standard required for my end product, not what is the standard required for my component products. And so, in the SON standard, for example, a cracked tomato might not be acceptable by SON standards. Well, a cracked tomato is acceptable for a processing standard because it will go into a facility and it will come out as a clean, good product that can be consumed. So there are a few differences between what the requirements are for consumers versus what the requirements are for industrial use. And as long as we bear that in mind, I think that the effort has been, very, very well undertaken, and I do commend SONCAP for that.
Now, given your Western experience of tomato farming, what would be your expectations from these codes of practices of the SON?
I mean, my expectations would be pretty much what they've set out. There's a minimum safety standard. If you read the code, and I'm sure that the code is publicly available now that it's been published, really most of it is around the chemical content of the tomatoes. You don't want to have residue on the fruits. You want to make sure that anything that's going into a consumer's mouth is safe. They have some requirements around size. They have some requirements around grading. Those are all pretty, not to use the word too much, but those are all pretty standards.
Regulations, of course, often attract investments. Now, do you see government initiatives like this encouraging more foreign investors into the cold chain logistics side of the business, for example?
Cold chain has been something that people talk about a lot. As a private sector person, my view is also skewed to the private sector, and I think much more about what consumers want than around what regulations will do or won't do for investors. And to me, what I think will drive the cold chain investments the most is whether or not you can prove that consumers are willing to pay the extra price for tomatoes or any fruits that have been put through a cold chain system. Because remember, the cold chain will increase the cost of that fruit. Now, there's supposed to be a commensurate savings because of less wastage. I think that for investors to really move in a major way in this space, they need to see that borne out. They need to see that the cost of investing in a cold chain is recouped by the increased amount of fruits that consumers buy. I think that whether you have regulations or not in this area, that test is still something that has to be done in order for investors to really move in this space.
And talking about post-harvest losses and food waste management of the value chain now, Rockefeller Foundation is already involved in this aspect. Do you think that there's a need for more of such initiatives, perhaps to get Nigeria off the importation of paste?
That's a great question. I really do commend the Rockefeller Foundation for, first of all, even highlighting and bringing this to the attention of so many people who might not have known that it was a problem. Post-harvest loss is a huge issue in Nigeria. Post-harvest handling of fruits and vegetables, post-harvest handling and storage, even of grains, can lead to huge amounts of deterioration, not just in perishable products like tomatoes, but even in rice or maize, other areas. So I think that, these initiatives are certainly always welcome. And I think that, strong collaboration to make whatever the investment is or whatever the initiative is work sustainably, in a market-driven solution, even after the donor, completes their work is really where and how I think those dollars can be most effectively spent.
But how much of compliance with the codes of practices do you see among the tomato growers locally?
So that's a great question. Local farmers, many of them don't have access to resources. They wouldn't even know, where SONCAP is or how to download or, request for the SON regulations and standards. And I think that, one of the things that is really important is education, not just of consumers, but education of the producers. We've seen that farmers are very receptive to adopting better practices, again, when it makes financial sense for them. So, at Tomato Joss, we're working right now with about 300 farmers, And we are helping them to understand why it's important to wear protective gear when you spray chemicals, why it's important not to spray chemicals within 2 weeks of when you're going to harvest. Things like that, they haven't necessarily been taught when they've been farming, and they've been farming for the past 20, 30 years. So there certainly is a component there that's important to consider, which is the education of small farmers and making sure that we're not excluding farmers from a market by imposing regulations that they cannot adhere to.
And still talking about not excluding the farmers now, what do you make of the fact that the standards will actually be translated into local languages for some of these farmers?
I think that's great. I think, I'm somebody who is very much for open communication and open information sharing. So I think any way that you can share the information with farmers is a plus.
CEO of Tomato Just, Mira Mehta, thanks for speaking with us on Business Morning.
Thanks so much for having me.
Well, let's switch to the domestic commodities market, and a research analyst at the FDC, Nosike Nwajide, joins us now. He's right here in the studio with us. Good morning, Nosike. Thanks for coming on the program.
Good morning. It's always my pleasure.
So let's take the conversation from where Mira left off, talking about the SON standards for the tomato value chain. What are your expectations from the standards?
My expectations are of increased efficiency in the near term. Increased efficiency, then towards self-sufficiency in the industry, then towards exports in the medium to long term. The losses, current losses, as she said, are close to 50%. If you can lower those losses, even if it's just by 25%, you have increased produce. If you can efficiently take them from where they are planted, harvested, and more efficient logistics towards where they are processed or towards the market, so that you lower the losses, then you can increase the output. Increased output also means lower prices in the market. In the end, it's more jobs for people in the processing plants. We Nigerians, we import tomato paste. We're a net importer. But if we could lower imports in the near term, in a year, 2 years by half, that would increase the number of jobs, increase the number of increase output affecting GDP growth, lower the amount we require to import these, forex, take some pressure off the forex demand. So all in all, it's positive for the Nigerian economy, and it's something that I feel that should have been done earlier.
Now let's switch now to the Monetary Policy Committee meeting of the Central Bank, which is holding today. Of course, we expect the briefing from the CBN governor at 2 p.m. later today. But what are the FDC's expectations from today's meeting?
Our expectations are that the MPC will hold on all, maintain status quo on all policy parameters. It's caught between, the outlook for inflation at the moment is a bit, it's not very rosy. Then you have a looming recession. We're probably already in a recession. It's Q2. So you have GDP growth on one hand and inflation expectations on the other hand that you expect to spike because of there's been a raft of intervention measures by the CBN. Money supply is expected to rise by at least $2 trillion. We've borrowed from the IMF about $3.4 billion. We expect to borrow more from the World Bank and the African Development Bank. These borrowings, so it's increased money supply in the Nigerian economy will have consequences on inflation. So the MPC is keeping a keen eye on inflation. There's also, the loss in forex proceeds from lower oil prices. There's increased pressures on the exchange rate. Pressures on the external reserves have somewhat abated because of increased borrowings, foreign currency borrowings that are 3.4 billion, another 3.5 billion. So that's $7 billion. And forex accretion is expected to take place in the coming months. But when you try to balance it, you need to, those intervention measures, we need to watch out for what's impact. How do we estimate the impact now? We can't. So we'll probably wait till July before they can see, okay, what has happened so far, how much has the money supply grown. Then they can, move any levels. For now, we think that they will hold on all policy parameters.
But are we likely to see a further adjustment to the FX rate?
Well, given that, borrowing money from the IMF, there were some conditionalities. One of those was the unified exchange rate. The other one was a movement adopting a more flexible exchange rate, so to speak. At the moment, we're seeing forex accretion. So those dollar earnings, increased dollar earnings, and then there have been measures by the CBN to curtail foreign currency demand. So if in the end foreign exchange rate pressures persist, that might happen. But for the near term, I don't see that happening. I don't see the CBN adjusting the official or the IEFX. There'll be increased pressure on the parallel market. It might go to the end of 460, 465 even. But for now, the official and the IEFX rates are somewhat stable.
Well, let's talk about the capital importation data, which was released a few days ago by the NBS. Of course, we saw that hot money from portfolio investments pushed up capital importation to $5.85 billion for the period.
Yes, hot money is basically FPI. It's called hot money because it's money that can come in and easily go. It's very sensitive to movements in the exchange rate, movements in interest rates as well. Where what has not really been focused on is FDI. FDI is what creates jobs, investments, and ultimately GDP growth. But FPI is something that it's jumped by 50%, but going into Q2. Is something we expect to fall significantly, given global developments and movement in capital. People, foreign portfolio investors are going to move to safe havens, maybe gold, but as the global economy, as more and more countries lift their lockdowns, and there's an increase in confidence, and investors also look at the steps the CBN taken to strengthening the exchange rate, so to speak, or unify the exchange rate. We look at all those policies and we might see increased FPI flows in Q3. But for now, we expect that in Q2, it will fall significantly. And also FDI, not just FPI, but investments as a whole will fall significantly in Q2.
Now, let's talk about the fall in FDI. Now, of course, we saw a decline of 16.72% to $214.25 million. What was responsible for this? In an increasingly globalized world, FDI will flow to places where, there are less constraints to production, so to speak. So it's something that an investor, you want to invest in Ghana, you want to invest in Nigeria, you want to invest in South Africa, you weigh all your options. Where do I have less constraints to production? We're all aware of the existing constraints to production in Nigeria: power, logistics, high interest rates, all of those issues. So it's something that's been somewhat on a declining trend since the recession of 2015. So until these constraints to production are tackled, so to speak, then we can see sustained increase in foreign direct investment inflows. For now, we expect that to keep fluctuating until investors gain confidence in the Nigerian economy. And what about the external reserves now? Of course, we've seen a rise, a 5.55% rise to $35.77 billion. What would be the impact of dividend repatriation on the I&E window, for instance?
Well, obviously, increased forex supply means that the investors can now repatriate their money. I mean, some investors were scared with the external reserves had been depleting for so long, since I think about June or July last year. And obviously that continuous depletion, I mean, as an investor, you keep an eye on it. But now that you've seen that there's been some accretion, you know that Nigeria is going to borrow more, and you've seen that there's been steps. Okay, oil prices are now rising. They're in the mid-30s, so to speak. But Nigeria's production is going to fall somewhat. So oil proceeds, how much are oil proceeds going to affect the reserves, and how much of that is actually external borrowing? But for now, there's obviously the ease of being able to repatriate your money. But investors, something investors will keep a keen eye on. As oil prices rise, increased investor optimism, and less pressure on the IEFX window.
And just before you go, Nosiko, tell us what's the latest with regards to domestic commodity prices?
Well, we'll continue to see the impact of the lockdown, so to speak, or movement restrictions. It's a curfew that affect. This is the planting season. They will affect the commodity supply chain, so to speak. So there will be some commodities, like last week we heard of the bakers saying that prices might rise as much as 60%, because all prices have risen. There's the exchange rate pass through, and there's scarcity because it's the planting season. So those factors contrive to push up commodity prices. So we expect that they keep rising until this lockdown movement restrictions are ended completely. So that factor will be taken away.
Research analyst at the FDC, Nosiko Nwajide, thanks for speaking with us on Business Morning.
Always my pleasure.
We'll cross over to London and the debt and currencies markets when we return in just a moment. Please stay with us. Let's go over now to London, where Juliana Olayinka is ready to update us on today's business headlines. Good morning, Juliana. It's good to see you. So EasyJet plans to cut up to 30% of workforce and shrink fleet amid COVID-19 crisis. Any idea the rationale behind the airline's COVID-19 strategy?
Good morning, Bissy. Well, the rationale is pretty simple, and that's to save money amidst this pandemic, and that has really swamped the airline industry. EasyJet, the budget airline based in Luton, which is just north of London, they've joined other airlines such as British Airways and Ryanair and announced this mass job cut. They currently employ about 15,000 people. With the 30%, it's expected that 4,500 jobs will be going from ground crew up into pilot crew. Their CEO was speaking earlier today, and he said he doesn't expect 2019 passenger levels to return until at least another 3 years, which is pretty worrying for people that are working within the industry. And it was just a couple of days ago, apparently, that staff that was working for EasyJet received a really nice letter for him. So it's come as much of a surprise this morning.
How are investors buying into the company's plans? Tell us, how did the stock open this morning?
Well, surprisingly, the stock's opened 4.5% higher. I think shareholders were pretty happy with the fact that EasyJet are taking a long-term strategy. We had heard from BA that they don't expect the passenger numbers to be back for 4 years. EasyJet have said 3 years. How is an airline supposed to survive if it doesn't have people flying? So I believe that's probably one of the reasons why their shares were up this morning. EasyJet have also announced that flights will start on the 15th of June. At the moment, it will just be between Gatwick and France and some domestic flights within country. And they did say that at the moment they have had a lot of pre-bookings. So that was also another reason why investors were chuffed. But of course, the union bosses are outraged. They said this is a kick in the teeth for staff. And it's a really kind of sudden knee-jerk reaction when the aviation industry's failures are not likely to last for more than a year.
Aside from EasyJet, Juliana, tell us, what's the day looking like for the market street?
Well, the FTSE actually opened pretty high this morning, not as high as it had earlier in the week, but it looks as if the FTSE may actually be going back to the kind of heights we were seeing pre-lockdown. At the moment, the pound is 0.01% down against the dollar. I think in terms of what everybody's looking for, it's that US job weekly data. It has been creeping up, and there are some analysts that are wondering, is this just a short-term out-of-job issue that the pandemic has caused, or are these numbers showing, Americans that could be out of jobs for the long term? So that has been a much watch for the markets, and in London, people will be watching to see what those data revealed today.
Many thanks, Juliana. We'll see you again later.
Thank you.
Time now for Edidion Nwan to tell us what went down at the domestic equities market yesterday. Good morning, Eddie. So the investors are still smiling at the Nigerian Stock Exchange. Tell us more about yesterday's activities.
Good morning, BC. The bull run continued at the market yesterday, although we saw the index rise marginally by 0.07% to 25,221.29 points, while the equity cap added 8 billion naira to 13.144 trillion naira. The total volume of trades increased by 124.1% to 508.60 million units, valued at 5.59 billion naira, and all of that was traded in 7,759 deals. Now, FBN Holdings was the most traded stock by volume at 120.86 million units. If we move to the sectoral chart now, we see that the banking index took the heaviest, that gained the most by 5.36%, and that was largely due to gains on tier 1 lenders and other stocks on that counter. The consumer goods rose by 3.09%. thanks to Nigerian breweries, Dangote Sugar, Cadbury, and Guinness. And while on the flip side, industrial goods lost by 1.98%. But let's talk to Mr. Tajuddin. He's a stockbroker at Valmont Securities. Good morning, Mr. Tajuddin. Thank you for joining us on the program.
Yeah, good morning.
Can you tell us what was responsible for the decline on the industrial goods counter? Although we saw gains from Dangote Cement, Lafarge, and Qtix, but that sector declined by 1.98%. Can you tell us what was responsible for that?
I think the question, but you say what was responsible for?
Yeah, what was responsible for the declines on industrial goods sector?
Decline?
Yes.
Well, you can see clearly that there has been renewed interest in banking stocks and more liquid stocks in the market. What is happening is that the other stocks from but the liquid stocks are stocks that investors are taking because of their low prices. The prices are not reached the level where they probably before the lockdown. So there's so much interest in the other than so those people are associated with this stock like whatever you see, so they want the it's not temporary, there's no impact on that stock.
Thank you, Mr. Tajuddin. We'll have to leave it there for today, but thank you for your input on the program. Tajuddin Olayinka is a stockbroker at Valmont Securities. Now we'll move over to the fixed income market, where the bond market, we saw just 23 deals there yesterday worth 10.52 billion naira. At the Nigerian Treasury bills market as well, we saw only six deals worth 171.98 million naira. There's a primary market auction yesterday, but we'll get more information about that shortly. The OMO market yesterday, we saw 5 deals worth 4 billion naira. Activity hasn't been so much on that segment of the market, but we'll see how trading goes today. Investors are paying attention to the MPC meeting today, so by 2 o'clock we'll hear what the committee's decisions are. Can we talk to Ifeoma now? She's a fixed income dealer at FSDH Merchant Bank. Good morning, Ifeoma. Thank you for joining us on the program.
Thank you for having me.
So please tell us about the primary market auction yesterday.
Okay. As expected, the MTB auction was oversubscribed, with rates inching up on the 364-day deal to 4.01 from 3.84% recorded at the previous auction, while the 91 and the 182-day deals dipped marginally. The CBN rolled over exactly what matched, that's 59 billion. They sold 20 billion. They sold 20 billion on the 91 days, 19 billion on the 182 days, and 19.84 on the 364 days deal.
Okay, thank you, Ifeoma, for your input on the program. Well, BC, I guess investors are paying attention to the MPC's decisions today, so we'll see how that goes out by 2 o'clock.
Of course, Adidion, we're all counting down to 2 o'clock to see or to hear what decisions the MPC would be announcing to us. Thank you, Eddie. And just before we go, of course, let's remind you again that the Monetary Policy Committee of the Central Bank of Nigeria would be holding its third rate-setting meeting for the year today. Of course, that meeting was earlier meant to hold on Monday and Tuesday, but had to be rescheduled because of the public holidays. At the last meeting in March, the committee left all key rates unchanged, and citing the continued rise in domestic prices, the decline in oil prices, and exchange rate pressure, all caused by the ravaging COVID-19 pandemic. Don't forget to join us at 1:30 p.m. as we begin our countdown to the MPC decisions on Channels Television and the live briefing by the CBN Governor, Mr. Godwin Emefiele, which will be broadcast live on Channels Television at 2 p.m. And that's where we leave it on today's program. Thank you for watching. I am BC Adebayo.